Hey, welcome back to the channel for another tier list video. This time we're doing the all-time best passives in Smite. In case that's not clear enough, this list is based purely on the power of the god's passive, not their overall power or meta relevance. A trash god in the current meta could be S+ if they have a broken passive, you get the idea. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and let's jump right in with Achilles. So for me, I'm going to put Achilles in A+. I originally had Achilles in S when I was going to do this tier list because the sheer amount of stats his passive gives is quite insane. Especially pre-nerf Achilles would have definitely been S tier, maybe even S+ with the ridiculous amount of stats he gets from that passive, mainly the off-armor passive with the movement speed and power. But I think after the few nerfs it's taken, it's just like some decent, nice added stats which makes it a bit better than the average passive, but not insane, so A+. Speaking of average passives, Agnes is pretty average. It's just some extra damage on all of his abilities when he hits 4 basic attacks. Nothing special, but nothing terrible either. AMC's Bees, very similar thing to Agnes passive, just a little bit of extra damage when he hits things, nothing crazy, but nothing terrible. Apwash, once again I'm thinking A tier for Apwash. His whole corpses thing is technically not specifically as passive, it's mainly as passive that it's involved in eating the corpses to gain the cooldown reduction and healing, which is a really nice effect, don't get me wrong. But it's not like his passive powers his entire kit, like Corpse Explosion would still be good even without the passive because it's the one that spawns the corpses. So overall I think Apwash is just a pretty average passive. And her I'm going to put in A+. Once again, like with Achilles, this one is probably potentially bordering on S because it's a really strong passive in the duo lane for early game fights. Just having that extra damage over pretty much every other ADC in the early game makes Anha absolutely dominant and allows him to just snowball his game. Amaterasu, S tier passive. Amaterasu's passive is consistently underrated by pretty much everyone I feel like. 10% damage increase on an objective allows you to just burn it so much faster. 10% damage increase if you manage to get your Amaterasu onto their carry is really insane as well. Even just putting it on one of their frontline tanks, just boxing one of their frontline tanks in a team fight, allowing your teammates to throw abilities at them and deal 10% more damage. And hell, it even improves her wave clear quite well. If you stack up the passive on one of the front minions of the wave before you throw your 2 at the wave, you do 10% more damage to it. What's not to love? Anubis passive. So another one that I think is bordering really between tiers, it's either S or S+. Anubis's passive just does an absolutely ridiculous amount of stuff. Not only does it give you double lifesteal, or double healing from lifesteal technically, it also gives you CCR and protections, like 2 things that you really need on Anubis because he has no mobility. Honestly, this passive just fits Anubis really well, and it's definitely one of the most powerful passives in the game for the sheer amount of stuff that it gives. Alquang, A tier, pretty balanced passive, he just gets some healing and cooldown reduction off of his abilities every now and then, it's nothing crazy. But it's also not one of the worst passives in the game either. Aphrodite, probably A tier as well. I was considering maybe putting Aphrodite in A+. Actually, no, I'll put Aphrodite in A+, because the protection she gets from her passive is actually really strong if you're in a team fight. For those that don't know, Aphrodite gets protections for every ally and enemy around her, kind of like Thor's passive, but it also works for allies. So when you're in a team fight and you have like maybe 3 enemies and 3 allies all near you, you get a large boost of protections from this. I think it's a low A+ tier, but Aphrodite passive is definitely fairly strong. Speaking of strong passives, we have Apollo's passive straight to S+. Being able to gain 100% more attack speed for 5 auto attacks is just insane at all stages of the game. Early game it just gives you a nice boost to be able to box and clear well, late game it absolutely shreds people because you don't need to build as much attack speed on Apollo, so you can just melt people once you get this passive up. I don't think anyone's really arguing that Apollo passive is not top tier. And straight from top to straight to the bottom, one of the worst passives in the game in my opinion is Arachne passive. I'm going to put it in B tier. Arachne passive is just strictly worse than Daji's, which I think is bad design. And in terms of power level, it's just terrible as well. It's a tiny bit of extra damage that only really becomes relevant once the enemy gets below about 50% health. If you're hitting enemies down from 100% health, you pretty much don't have a passive. Ares, A+ tier. For me, Ares passive is just like a little better than a lot of these fairly average passives because of the insane amount of power he gets just from building items that he would normally build anyway. In support, and even sometimes in solo, you want to buy aura items anyway, and Ares getting 33 power on every single item that he buys is just really strong. Artemis, A. It's a fairly generic, boring passive, it's just some extra damage to targets that are CC'd, helps out her wave clear a little bit and also her boxing when you hit them with the 3. Artio, A+. I was considering putting this one S because of the sheer amount of protection shred that it gives. It shreds up to 16% protections, which obviously works for your entire team, so you're boosting your mage damage as well. But overall, when I looked at some of the other passives I was going to put in S tier, mainly like Amaterasu and Anubis that we already have in here, it's not as good as them. I feel like it's more on level with these A+ passives. Athena, A tier. Pretty balanced. She gets a nice reach auto attack which can hit the entire minion wave, allows her to clear a lot faster and also poke people from range. Awilix, another pretty balanced passive, just a nice damage boost if she attacks first from out of combat. A lot of the time you do attack first from out of combat, so it's nice to just have that. Bacchus, definitely S tier. The amount of insane mitigations that Bacchus gets from this passive is just ridiculous. For those that don't know, Bacchus gets free power and mitigation depending on if he's tipsy or smashed on his passive. And while it does require the one to activate, it's still a ridiculous passive. Bacchusura, A+. So Bacchusura gets up to 24% attack speed and movement speed with this passive fully stacked, which would probably warrant an SRS plus placement, but the fact is that he has to kill minions to keep it stacked up, and often in teamfights you can't really do that too well. Bacca really shines where he can either stack up his passive in lane or ideally in the jungle before he goes for a gank. You can clear a full camp, get that passive up to 3 stacks, then go for your gank with that increased attack speed and movement speed. And in general, it just helps Bacchusura clear the jungle because movement speed and attack speed is always going to help. Baron Samedi, S tier. The sheer amount of stuff Baron's passive does is just ridiculous. It gives extra effects to all of his abilities and makes enemies take more damage from him just from having Hysteria stacked up. Not to mention that's only half of his passive, he also gets Baron's Brew for him and his entire team, which is a ridiculously powerful potion effect. Not much to complain about with Baron passive really, but it's not like top tier, like top 5 most broken in the game. Bastet, so this is working off her new passive, which gives her increased movement speed when she's running towards target she's hit with Declaw. For me, I think this is just A tier, it's nothing insane, it's just a little bit of extra movement speed that is very nice for an assassin, but it's not crazy. Bellona, A+, she actually gets a lot of stats from her passive even after the many nerfs that it's received. She gets movement speed and protections just for auto-attacking, which she always does in lane. For example, like a Bacchusura passive, he has to stack it up by killing things, but Bellona just stacks it up by auto-attacking the minion wave, so she almost always has this passive up when she's fighting in solo, and it makes her really strong. It's quite an underrated part of Bellona's kit in my opinion. Cabrakan, A tier. While technically you could kind of class Cabrakan's passive as 25% total damage mitigation, 5% for each team member. For me, I feel like it never really works out that way because a lot of the early game, if you're Cabrakan solo or jungle, you're just applying it to one person. If you're Cabrakan support for whatever reason, you're only applying it to 2 people. And then even in team fighting scenarios, you're not realistically going to be grouped up as a 5 to get full Cabrakan passive value, it's probably going to be hitting 1 or 2 people. Which doesn't make it terrible, but also doesn't make it insane, because it never really reaches its full potential. Camazotz, A+. So Camazott's passive is pretty much what makes him viable in solo lane, to be honest. The increased healing and lifesteal is really good, plus the pools he can just heal himself off of is really ridiculous for sustaining in solo. Obviously he has other things like the Vampire Bat, Space, Lifesteal and the 3, but the amount of healing he gets from the passive is really strong. Cerberus, I'm going to go with B+. I feel like Cerberus passive is good if you're against a healer, but the fact that it's so situational means I'm going to put it lower than some of these other A tier passives that are just generically useful. Kernanos, also B+. It's just a not very powerful passive, this one. It's nothing to do with being situational, it's just that really you tend to not be up in the face of minions when you're clearing with Kernanos, and even if you are, it's just a little bit of bonus damage to the minion wave. Because realistically, you're not going to get that cleave off on 2 gods, it's just for increased clear speed. I know Kernanos was somewhat designed with jungle in mind, so maybe that's why they gave him that passive, so he could clear jungle camps faster, like hitting the side minions while he hits the big minion with his auto attacks, but it didn't really work out for the way he's played in the present day. Shaq. Now I was going to go A tier for this, but I think on a bit more thought, I'm going to put him in A+. Even in solo lane these days, with blue buff and the Totem of Ku and mana regen and all that stuff, where you don't really need to regen that much mana, having a free ability every 5 auto attacks is just really nice. Often he can get this off twice per wave and he just out-sustains other people ridiculously in solo because he gets free mana cost abilities and his healing. Without this passive, Chuck definitely won't be as oppressive in solo since he can even lose his blue buff and still oppress the enemy solo. Changa, A+. So Changa is a 2-part passive. She gets the bonus movement speed whenever she uses her abilities, which is already pretty nice, and then she also gets the Jade Rabbit, which is very good as well. Being able to buy items from the base is an underrated part of her kit in my opinion, and people often don't use it that well. Really with Changa what you want to be doing is saving up, buying a massive power spike item so the enemy doesn't realise you bought it and then fucking people up, which of course is all down to her passive. Chernobog, A tier. It's just a little bit of extra damage every 3rd auto attack, there's nothing crazy about Chernobog passive. Chiron, A tier again. It's just some nice healing, kind of similar to Chernobog, it's just a fairly base, boring effect, but it's not terrible either. Kronos, A+. So I was considering putting Kronos passive in A simply because it takes so long to get online. Considering it takes 50 minutes to get the full benefit from this passive, and most games do not go 50 minutes in Conquest, never mind in other game modes, but to be honest, 100 power can't be laughed at. If you do eventually get to late game with Kronos and you have 100 free power, that's just completely insane. So I had to put it above some of these other A tier placements. Cuchulainn, S+. So Cuchulainn's entire rage mechanic transforming all those other abilities completely tied to his passive. If you look at it that way, there's no arguing that Cuchulainn passive is one of the best in the game, if not the best. Cupid, A tier. So Cupid passive basically increases his damage and healing by a little bit, but also allows his Heart Bomb to stun. If it didn't have the Heart Bomb stun mechanic and that was actually tied to the Heart Bomb ability itself, it would be lower on this list, but the fact that it enables his stun on Heart Bomb is really powerful. Daji? So I was talking about Daji earlier with it being just better Arachne passive. It doesn't mean it's a good passive, so I'm still putting it in B+, but it is strictly better Arachne passive basically. Since she just gets free damage on all her autos, whereas Arachne has to be auto-attacking low health people to get any kind of benefit. Discordia, A+. Discordia passive is one that's just always useful no matter what the fuck you're doing in the game. You could be feeding your brains out and Discordia passive is still going to be useful because one of your teammates will be doing well and they'll be getting that bonus. It means I can't really put it lower than A+, to be honest. Erlang Shen, also A+. So while we're on the train of Arachne and Daji, Erlang's passive is somewhat similar in that it just gives extra damage to his auto attacks, but Erlang's is more consistent because it just does the damage every single time, but it also does 1% max health of the target that you're hitting, which makes it just outright stronger than Daji and Arachne passive. Fafnir, A+. So for those that don't know, Fafnir gets up to 30 protections based on how much gold he's holding, up to 1000 gold. So fairly often, and when you're in between backs, you're going to have between 500 and 1500 gold, and you'll be getting a lot of benefit out of Fafnir's passive. Fenrir, A tier. So the only reason Fenrir passive isn't lower is because it's built into his kit and he wouldn't be able to stun with his jump without it. Personally, I think they should remove the whole mechanic, attach the runes to the jump and only make it stun, make the other abilities normal and give him a proper passive, but I'm not sure if that's feasible for high-res to do. But in terms of the overall power of the passive, it's basically just used to stun with the 1 and boost his other abilities a little bit. So it's not terrible, but it's not great. Freya, A+. So I've learned from the last time I did a worst passives video and put Freya on there, everyone raged the fuck out of me, and I can kind of understand why. It was a long time ago when I made that video, and I severely underrated the effect of early game lifesteal, or lifesteal in general. Just having that 10% plus free lifesteal based on your level with Freya is just what carries her through the early game and makes her really strong late game as well. So for me, Ganesh is a weird one. I'm going to put it in A tier simply because I feel like Ganesh passive is really strong, but also you could look at it as being a useless passive. While it does increase his assist range a little bit and all that stuff, which is nice, you could just say don't steal the kills and your carries could get them. But in a real game, that never really works out, and it's nice to have Ganesha passive as a fallback where you can take kills and not feel bad about it, so I'm going to put it in A tier. So Geb, I was thinking maybe even B+ for Geb, but I'm going to put it in A simply because it's a really hard meta counter. If there's hunters running around everywhere and some assassins like Neja all building crit, Geb is insane. But in metas where it's a full kin size on the ADCs, no crit junglers are viable, Geb passive is almost useless. So it really does kind of depend on the situation. Which I know I put Cerberus in B+ for that, but I feel like Geb's is overall a bit more useful because you see crit a lot more than you see full-on healers. Speaking of full-on healers, I'm going to put Guan Yu passive in A+. So Guan passive is sort of like Fenrir passive in a way, in that you stack it up and then it boosts your next ability, but Guan's passive is a lot better, I think. It boosts all of his abilities with a really strong effect, whereas with Fenrir's, you're only really looking to use it for the jump. The 2 and the 3 and the ult work well enough without the runes, and you want to really save them for the jump to get the stun. Whereas with Guan's, you'd be fine upgrading any of your abilities really, and it's a quite strong passive. Hachiman, A+. So once again, in that worst passives video I did a while ago where I talked about Freya passive being bad, I also called Hachiman passive bad, and once again I've learned from that mistake. It's actually really powerful to never have to buy mana potions on Hachiman. You can just rush straight into health potions, kind of like you do in solo, and just use your passive to regen mana. I severely underrated the fact that mana regen is really powerful in the early game in that video, and the Hachiman passive is definitely worth a rating that's above average. Hades, A tier. So Hades doesn't really work without Blight because it's the whole reason why his kit's so powerful, but I feel like once again with Fenrir they could sort of rework that into like a part of his ability and give him a proper passive. But as it stands right now, it is technically needed for his kit to be any good, so I can't really put it any lower than A tier. Even if the passive itself doesn't actually really do anything. Hebo, A tier. So Hebo's is just a nice passive. He just gets bonus % power every time he casts an ability. You can't really argue with that and call it terrible, but it's not the best passive in the game either. Heimdall passive is A tier, I think. Having extra physical power and those vision benefits are nice, but it also does reduce Heimdall's crit damage by 30%, which is not great. But it's also kind of reasonable because his auto attacks scale very well. I'm not entirely sure on this passive, which is kind of why I put it in A tier, but it seems fairly balanced to me. Hell passive, A+. So Hell passive actually gives you I think it's a 20% damage boost and healing boost once you're fully attuned to your stance, which takes 3 seconds. Which really isn't all that long. Once you swap to the stance, you can just wait a few seconds before you use your abilities, and then you do absolutely dominate because of the 20% bonuses that this gives. Hera, A tier. So Hera's passive is basically reducing the cooldown of Argus every time you hit a normal ability, which is definitely really strong. Considering Argus only goes on cooldown when he dies, you're often waiting a long time between Argus casts. Because you'll cast Argus, it'll be on a 90-second cooldown, but you'll also have Argus alive for 30 seconds, so it's a 120-second cooldown. But this passive kind of mitigates that in that you can reduce the cooldown by casting regular abilities and have it up in a more reasonable time. Hercules, A+. So Hercules gets 18 free power at level 1, making him pretty much unboxable in solo by anyone. That just can't be understated, and even as you level up, the extra power that you get from it for free is just really nice. Horus, A tier. So Horus just gets a nice boost to protections and CCR while he's got his passive stacked up, and then even if it does wear off, he still gets rewarded with a heal, so there's nothing really wrong with this passive. Hui passive, pretty terrible in my opinion. It's kind of just a worse version of Geb passive in that you can't be crit again for a while, but often people don't run too much crit chance and they can wait out the passive and just crit you again straight afterwards. Whereas with Geb, at least he's guaranteed to reduce crit damage down by quite a significant margin. If Hui passive was more on the power level of Geb, I would put it in A tier, but it's too situational given that it's also a meta call, and even if you do meta call into a crit meta, it's still not even that good, so I'm going to put it in B+. Hunbats, just some nice extra damage on his autos, it's like a mini Hydra's Lament. Nothing bad, also nothing crazy. This bitch, A+. So now that her passive is permanent and she gets 10% cooldown reduction once finishing it, it's definitely a really powerful passive. Izanami, A tier, the penetration is nice but it's nothing crazy. Janus, A tier, bonus damage on his abilities when you go through the 3 or through a portal. It's a nice thing to have, but it's not an integral part of his kit or anything like that. Jingwei, S tier. Jingwei's passive, even after the nerfs, pretty much makes her unpokeable out of lane because you get poked out, you fly straight back to lane, you miss almost no farm, and she's just become one of the safest, reliable ADC picks because of that. Jormungandr. So I've heard a lot of people say conflicting things about his passive. A lot of people say it's terrible because of the damage increase and the slow that he gets, and a lot of people say it's insane because he hard counters knockups. For me, I think it's somewhere in the middle. It's got a really powerful effect, but an equally powerful drawback. I think they did quite well designing this passive, and it's actually a pretty balanced passive in my opinion. But you know what's not a balanced passive? Kali passive. Yeah, Marked for Death is definitely one of the top 3 passives in the game in my opinion. Being able to just full heal yourself and run through teams just makes Kali so incredibly strong late game. Her entire kit wouldn't even work without this passive, and it's what makes her so strong. Khepri, A tier. It's really nice to have that little bit of extra shielding, especially when you're in duo lane, just giving your ADC some shielding and at the start of the game and stuff, but it's nothing crazy. King Arthur, once again, pretty normal passive. He just gets extra energy gain and a bit of damage mitigation when it's stacked up. Kukulkan, S. So the sheer amount of power that Kukulkan gets from this passive just for free is insane. Cuckoo passive is a lot like Chronos passive in a way, in that you're just getting free power out of nowhere, but Cuckoo's comes online a lot earlier and can actually surpass Chronos passive if you build a lot of mana. I think he gets something like 55 to 60 power just from base mana, and then if he's building Book of Thoth and other mana items, you can easily get that over 100 power, which is what Chronos passive gives you even at 50 minutes into the game. So really, Cuckoo's passive is just Chronos passive but better, and it's definitely really powerful. Kubakana, A tier. So it technically gives him a second chance at life, but often you will just die through this passive anyway and it does nothing for you, so it's really kind of a hit on base passive. Kuzumbo, so he gets some actually really nice damage mitigations from filling up his water bowl, and it's fairly easy to do. I feel like Kuzumbo passive is a little bit underrated and it's what makes him actually fairly strong. Loki, A tier, it's just some nice bonus damage if you're hitting enemies in the back, synergizes quite well with his ultimate. Medusa, A, it's really nice to have no side strafe and very little backpedal movement penalty. It makes boxing quite a lot easier on Medusa, but to be fair, it doesn't actually really do too much for you if you're not like juking abilities with it. In terms of just a straight damage fight, it does nothing for you, but often you will be able to juke enemy auto attacks and move around a lot quicker on Medusa, which makes it quite strong. Mercury, S. So much like Kukulkan, Mercury just gets free power out of nowhere when he's building his movement speed. I think his boots get something like 15 to 20 free extra power on them just because of the movement speed that they give. And if he's building any more movement speed like Haste and Katana Stone Cutting Sword, he just stacks that even higher. And then also he gets that part of his passive where if he's moved 500 units, he gets a massive amount of bonus damage. Well, it's technically not just if you've moved 500, it's the amount you've moved up to 500, you get bonus damage on your next auto attack. And that even charges from dashing and ulting into fights, so it's really strong. Merlin, B+, it's just a terrible version of Polynomicon on his passive. On Merlin, you're often managing many different abilities and trying to run away and stuff, you're often not auto-attacking very much. Merlin's much more efficient if you just dump your kit, stance change, dump your kit, and then make sure you're focusing on running and keeping yourself safe rather than auto-attacking people a lot. If you put Merlin passive on an auto-attack mage, it might be quite strong, but on Merlin, it just doesn't really fit. So of course Mulan is very new as of recording this video, but I'm going to take her passive as the bonus effects to her other abilities that it gives. So if we're taking it like that, it's definitely an S+ passive. The sheer amount of benefits it gives to her abilities is just absolutely ridiculous. Allowing the 1 to have an extra hit, the 2 to heal and double hit, the 3 to grapple walls, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Neith, A tier. She gets some weaves that really you're only looking to hit with your 1 or maybe your 2 if you're in desperate need of sustain. It's just a little bit of extra stuff that she can do with like the AoE root and things, but it's nothing insane. Nemesis, A+. So I feel like Nemesis passive is actually very underrated. The amount of percentage power steal that she can get is actually kind of ridiculous. I think she can steal up to 20% power, so 20% reduction for the enemy, 20% increase for her, which when she's boxing people can actually be really good. A lot of people sleep on this passive I think, but it's actually doing a lot of work when you're playing Nemesis. Nature, A tier. So Nature just gets a bit of extra movement speed when it's got its passive stacked up. Nothing really to talk about here. Nike passive, so before the Nike rework, when Nike passive was busted and was giving like 10% movement speed and 8% power to the entire team, it would be S+. But since it's Fall from Grace where they severely nerfed it to make Nike focus more on her actual kit and not just her passive, I think it's now just balanced. I think it gives something like 3 flat power and a tiny amount of movement speed to your entire team, which when you calculate it on 5 people is quite a lot, but it's really not that good. Nox passive, so Nox passive is actually just strictly worse Hebo passive, which means I definitely can't put it in A tier, but I don't think it's quite B tier either, so I think B+ is where I'm going to put it. Hebo passive just gives you 15% extra power from casting abilities, Nox gives you 12% extra power, makes you cast more abilities, and allows you to lose them by taking damage, so it's just worse than Hebo passive in almost every way. Nuwa, so Nuwa is another passive that I think is quite underrated. I'm going to put it in A+. A lot of people don't really recognize how powerful just having that on-demand route ready is. It actually scares people a lot. Like if you're clearing waves and you get that thing ready, just stop auto-attacking the wave and just try and throw it at the enemy, because if you throw it and then soldiers plus explosion, it's a really good combo for a lot of damage. Odin, so I think Odin passive is like A+, it's a little bit better than balanced I think. This isn't the Ring of Spears passive where you get free permanent power, this is the passive where whenever someone dies you get like 8% bonus power and movement speed, which can allow Odin to just snowball the fuck out of teamfights, because as soon as people start dying he just becomes a pretty much fucking super soldier that one-shots everyone. But then he could also be like, when fights aren't really happening, it's literally useless passive, so it kind of keeps it in check. Olaron passive, S tier. So being able to crit on your abilities just ups their damage by a massive amount, and all you have to do to get this passive online is just build power, which is what you were going to do anyway on Olaron, so I think it's really strong. Osiris, also S, a severely underrated passive that people who don't play solo don't realize how much this passive is doing for you. It's giving you 16% physical mitigation and 8% magical mitigation, which is already insane, and then you also get the haste effect on your auto attacks for like 6 auto attacks I believe it is. And this passive is so easy to stack up if you rank the 1 early game. Just throw the 1 at your enemy solo all the time, even just throw it at minions if you want to stack up the passive and just get that mitigation going. Pele, also S. I think before the nerfs, Pele passive could have been bordering on S+, just because of the insane turnaround she could get with it and the amount of healing it gave. But since it's been nerfed a lot, I think it's just a really strong passive now for like boxing and turning fights around, but it's not completely broken. Persephone passive, also S. I think Persephone passive is really strong simply because it gives her a second lease on life essentially. It's almost like a Kali ultimate in that regard, in that you can cheat death for a while and fuck people up before you eventually die. Except with Kali she has a passive that eventually full heals her on that, which is obviously a lot better. But Persephone being able to stay around if like she gets bursted down in fights, didn't really get a chance to get her kit off, she can use that passive to stay around, do a bit of damage before she dies, and hopefully her team can win that fight. Poseidon, A+. So it gets some nice amount of movement speed and a bit of extra damage on abilities just for stacking up Tide. It's pretty strong. Ra passive, 18% free movement speed that's pretty easy to keep stacked up constantly once you get some CDR, definitely worth doing. Raijin, A tier. So he gets some nice cooldown reduction on his abilities once he casts 4 of them. This does activate on all his abilities, which is quite strong and allows his ultimate to have a bit lower than average cooldown, but it's not like A+ worthy. Rama, A tier. So his astral arrows are his passive, so the whole interaction with the 1 being able to clear waves, the 3 crippling, that sort of stuff is really tied to his passive, which is why it's in A tier. Ratatoska, I really want to put Rat in S+, but I think I'm going to put him in S. Just because I don't think it's quite as powerful as things like Kali, Kukulkan, Apollo and Mulan passive, but it's definitely one of the upper S tiers because of the insane amount of power that the Archon provides. You can buy it from anywhere in base, it comes with more stats than base Warrior Tabai, and it comes with the passive that heals you. That's just completely ridiculous, and it makes Rat a monster in the early game. Raven, A tier. It's just some nice health shields and a little bit of movement speed once you have the shield active, once you auto-attack people. Scylla, S. So Scylla is literally strictly better Chronos passive. Chronos has to wait till 50 minutes into the game to get the 100 power, Scylla just has to hit level 20, which happens around 20 to 25 minutes depending on how far ahead or behind you are. And then once Scylla gets level 20, she has the 100 power that Chronos also gets, but then she also gets all the bonus effects on her abilities like triple roots on Sikkim, and the protection reduction on the 2 and stuff. Scylla passive is really fucking strong. Serket, so I was toying with putting this in S or A+, but I think I'm going to put it in A+. Being able to do 20% of the target's maximum health in physical damage is just really strong for the combo. But it is still mitigatable physical damage, not true damage, so really it's probably only going to do about 10% of the health in actual damage, so it's not completely ridiculous. Set, A+. So having the extra attack speed is just really nice. Like, you can pretty much always keep this passive stacked up and have that attack speed going, and then of course the ultimate uncaps the passive and allows you to go way past the attack speed cap. Skadi, S tier. So technically, Skadi's passive is Calder, so without it she wouldn't have Calder, so it's definitely very strong. I think if the passive didn't take up an ability slot for her, in that you have to use the 2 to control Calder, it would be S+, but the fact that it's a passive but also consumes one of your ability slots kind of keeps it in check a little bit, and it's not quite S+ tier. Sobek, A tier. So Sobek passive is very boring, but it honestly does the job. It gives you 10 free protections up to 3 stacks, so you can get up to 30 protections early game, which is pretty good. Sol passive, S+. So the amount of attack speed, power, and basic attack damage you get from this passive is just unrivaled by pretty much any other passive in the game. Yeah, Apollo passive gives more attack speed, but it doesn't give you more basic attack damage and power on top of that, does it? Sol is definitely top 5 passives in the entire game, I think. Wukong, A+. So when I was researching for this video, I was thinking Wukong passive was going to be a pretty boring, forgettable one, but it actually gives you a lot of stats. I think it's up to like 50 power and 30 protections or something like that, something close, when you drop below 50% health, and you can actually kind of cheese it with Wukong, where you can deliberately drop below 50% before you activate your healing on like Glad Shield and Chalice and stuff. Deliberately drop below 50% to proc that passive, and then go back above 50% so you don't risk dying, and fight with that bonus power. Susano, A+. So this passive actually had to be nerfed recently, but I think it's not actually that strong. It's just a little bit of extra damage on your abilities, but Susano already does a shit ton of damage, and it kind of makes him hit that critical mass where he's just one-shotting people. Sylvanas, A+ tier. So if Sylvanas passive was only the root, I probably would put it in A, but Sylvanas passive actually accounts for his AoE auto attacks, so I'm putting it in A+, because the AoE auto attacks are a lot of why Sylvanas is so strong in lane. Terra, A+. So she gets some nice benefits being able to smash the stones and things, but while she has stones active, she's able to slow people with her auto attacks and also becomes knock-up immune, which is just a way better way to counter knock-ups than your one passive in my opinion. Thanatos, S tier. So the amount of healing Thanatos gets from this is kinda ridiculous. It allows him to just out-sustain pretty much every other jungler. Even back in the day, it allowed Thanatos to play with Death's Toll instead of Bumba's Mask because of the ridiculous sustain that this gives. It's a very underrated passive in my opinion. Morrigan, A+. So it's a nice amount of extra damage actually. 9% of the target's max health when you just hit them with this AoE auto attack is really strong. It allows us to increase her clear speed quite a bit, and if you hit this on a god, it'll do a nice bit of take damage. Thor, A+. So Thor just gets a nice amount of power for fighting in people. Often he'll gank duo lane and be around 2 or maybe even 3 enemies and get some bonus power from this. You can't really argue with 30 free power out of nowhere. Thoth, A+. So Thoth just gets free penetration on this passive. It is capped based on his level, but having free penetration is just really nice. Penetration is one of the most powerful stats in the game. Tier, S. So Tier is sort of like a counter-esque type of passive because you want to pick it into things like Ymir or Athena that have really long CCs that you can counter with this. But honestly, even Tier against literally any comp, he's going to have some CC that's over 1 second, and he can just mitigate that down to 1, which is really ridiculous. Ula, B+. So it's one of the worst stand switcher passives in my opinion. It's just 1 second off of the reverse ability in the other stance, so if you cast Axe, it'll take 1 off of the bow stance 1. Honestly, at absolute maximum, you're going to get 3 seconds worth of cooldown reduction with this per stance switch, which isn't really that strong. For mana passive, so this is definitely S tier. For those that don't know, this is old Runeforged Hammer passive where he converts physical protection to power. He gets around 15 free power just from his base physical protections, and obviously he's going to be building a lot more physical protections to the point where he's probably getting up to about 50 free physical power from this passive late game, which is just insane. Vulcan, A+. So he gets some nice movement speed and mana regeneration whenever he's hitting abilities, and it actually sort of gives a Hachiman effect where Vulcan doesn't have to buy that many mana pots, maybe just like the 1. And also the extra movement speed is really nice because you can hit someone with Magma Bomb and then you just run away with the extra movement speed, or you can even use it to chase. Xbalanque, S. So his passive is super easy to stack up now and it's 30 free power. You can't really argue against that. Xingqian, so I think Xingqian passive is severely underrated. I'm going to actually put it in S tier. The amount of HP 5 he gets just makes him pretty much fucking invincible in solo. It's pretty much like having a constant health potion active when you play Xingqian, which is just really hard to fight into. Yamoja, so Yamoja's really new, I haven't played her too much, and her passive is kind of conflicting, so I'm just going to drop it in A tier. I don't really know where to place this one, so let me know your guys' thoughts on this one in the comments down below. Ymir, so I'm going to actually put this in A+. For those that don't know, Ymir passive isn't just you do extra damage with auto attacks to people. Anyone with the frostbite effect on them actually does 10% reduced damage output. So it's almost like giving your team 10% damage mitigation against that target specifically, which is really actually quite strong. Zeus, A tier, so his whole detonate charge thing wouldn't work without the passive, so I can't put it much lower than A tier, but it's not really that strong. And finally, Zhonghui, I'm going to put in A plus or S, probably S. Since Zhonghui gets a lot of free protections just from stacking up his passive demon bag, and you don't even need to do it with the exorcism anymore, you can just kill anything and he gets stacks on it, which is really nice. But that's about it from me with this tier list. Let me know if you agree or disagree down in the comments, especially about my top 5, because I'm pretty certain on these. Mulan, maybe not, it depends how you look at her passive, but definitely these 4, Kali, Sol, Kukulkan, Apollo, are definitely like top 4 passives in the entire game, I think. But some of the other ones, like the A and A plus tiers, could probably move around a little bit. Maybe the S tiers could come down to A plus, maybe some B pluses could go join Arachne. It really kind of depends, so let me know your thoughts down below. But that's it from me for this one. I'll catch you guys in another video later on. Peace out, you nerds.